mother is the youngest daughter of a very prominent Filipino family, the Castillos, and they're from a province called Pangasinan, north of Manila. And her father was the largest landowner in Pangasinan, 500 hectares of rice, 3 mansions, 27 servants, as my mother grew up with, who administered to her and her 9 sisters and 1 brother, Filipino family. So my mother married my father, who was a naval officer, came to the U.S. to raise 3 boys, and didn't tell any of us anything about her background. I knew she was from the Philippines. She made exotic food. She would talk on the phone in exotic languages, Tagalog, Ilocano, distinct dialects that I didn't realize until years later were actually different languages. And then occasionally, I would say like maybe once or twice a year, one of the aunts or uncles would come and visit with their spouses, and often cousins. And so we did interact with them then, but we just knew them as the rich aunts and uncles who bought us things that we weren't supposed to have. And my mother would get mad at them. But I didn't know anything about this background. So Salvador Laurel became the vice president of the Philippines. His older brother, Pepe Laurel, was my uncle, married to my mom's sister, Betty. And their father was Jose P. Laurel, who was the president of the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. And his relationship with Marcos and my Tito Pepe's relationship with Marcos goes all the way back to when Marcos was a young college student. In Philippine culture, anytime you do a favor for somebody, especially if it's a significant favor, that person in return owes you an utang na loob. So an utang is a debt, and loob is an internal. So it's an internal debt of gratitude, utang na loob. And if you don't fulfill your utang na loob, you are labeled walang hiya, which is without honor. So it's very, very important in this chivalrous sort of honor code of the Philippines that you honor these debts. My great uncle's action in overturning this lower court decision, Marcos took as an utang na loob, that he owed the old man this debt of gratitude. So that was the first one. My uncle told me the story that at one point during the war, Marcos was allegedly involved in leading a guerrilla band, but a lot of evidence shows that he really didn't fight the Japanese. He was mostly intent on the black market and profiting from the war. But at one point, he had to go to a hospital in Manila because he got really, really severely sick. And while he was in this Manila hospital, the Japanese secret police, the Kenpitai, they found out that he was in this hospital. And at the same time they found out, my uncle and his father found out. And so old man Laurel, the president, sent Tito Pepe to the hospital to warn Marcos that his identity had been exposed. And my uncle said he got to the hospital just before the secret police. And Marcos got out of there and hightailed it back up into the hills. So that's the second debt of gratitude. And then after the war, when Marcos began his political career, and Marcos was running as liberal, and old man Laurel ordered all of the political subordinates in the province that the Laurels controlled, Batangas province. He said, on your ballots, I don't care who you write in for the other 4 candidates, but for the 5th slot on your ballots, you have to write in Ferdinand Marcos. And so he threw his political support behind Marcos, crossed party lines to do so, and Marcos won the election, became the youngest congressman, and later would acknowledge that debt as well. So he, all through this political rise, he makes repeated speeches, repeatedly says that he owes this powerful utang na loob to the old man Laurel, who he considers like a father, who saved his life 3 times. And so once he made that declaration, there was the most prominent opposition leader in the Philippines was a man named Benigno Aquino. Benigno Aquino was the most prominent opposition leader. He was in exile. He lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, close to me. Benigno Aquino made his announcement that he was going to fly back. His flight was very well known. The plane lands. A military guard of like 6 soldiers and an officer come on board the plane to take him into arrest and put him in prison. So he was at the top of the stairs when someone put a gun to his head and shot him. And so, who could have shot him? And, the Marcos administration would make all of these claims that they had no idea. But the Philippines break into this tremendous frenzy of mourning. They have an open casket funeral so people can see that he was shot. Like that's his face. And then the woman hovering over the coffin is his wife, Corazon Aquino, Cory Aquino, who at this point was just a housewife. But this housewife, Corazon Aquino, Cory Aquino, had gone to school at St. Scholastica, where my mother went to school. And that summer was the summer after my sophomore year at Yale. I was walking home and I looked at the newsstand and I saw the New York Times and I was just like, the photograph of this guy face down on the tarmac, and then I read the headline and it's from the Philippines, and I'm like, wow, my mom's from the Philippines. This is some serious stuff. I picked up the copy of the paper, brought it home, was reading it. I called my mother on the phone, and there's something really odd. I said, I've been reading this article, and the other opposition leader who went to the airport to meet up with Aquino, I said, his name is Salvador Laurel. And I said, that name sounds really familiar. And my mother said, oh yeah, that's your uncle. And I was like, what? So that was a shock because I didn't realize that Salvador Laurel is the younger brother of my Tito Pepe. The reason I named him after Tio Pepe is because of his whiskers. So he reminded me of my uncle because of his whiskers and his dour expression. So I sort of did this double take and I asked my mom some more questions, and then a notion began forming in my head. I got in touch with my uncle, Tito Pepe, and I got in touch with him and I said, I'm interested in coming out to the Philippines, getting a travel fellowship and maybe doing some research on Philippine history. I had no idea what I was going to research at this point, but I thought, wow, this would be a great thing to do next summer. He wrote back this beautiful script. He said, oh, you're more than welcome to come stay with us. I can provide you with this and that and everything else to help you with whatever you'd like to do. And at the time, I didn't really realize, of course, what I was getting myself into. That following summer, 1984, was the first time I went to the Philippines. And I started to go to demonstrations because there were a lot of demonstrations being organized against Marcos. And yet, in 1984, the opposition had really not found its focus. There were just a lot of protests. And of course, after the furor, after the assassination, Marcos had suspended the whole idea of elections. And so 1984 was like this moment when I realized that there's another world beyond the world that I live in, and all the privileges that come with it. And I don't have the slightest idea what that's like. Marcos finally agreed to have elections in January of 1986. And so I started to make plans to return immediately before the elections because I knew stuff was going to happen. There was an outpouring of support for Corazon Aquino after her husband died. And she started leading demonstrations against Marcos, initially just to protest what happened to her husband, obviously. But because she was such a sympathetic figure and very articulate, Marcos really couldn't touch her because she's the widow of the man he's accused of killing. And so she started to tour the country and just generate incredible support. And of course, that coalesced into this concrete notion that she should run. And I knew this election was coming up. I also knew that I could only get a visa for 90 days. So I was going to need to time it so that something would happen within the 90 days. Otherwise, I'd have to fly back. So the elections were held, and I was issued fake media credentials with United Press International, but I wasn't with United Press International. But I had forged media credentials. And during the elections, I was an election observer. So there was a condo set up with, I think, 3 hotlines. So you could call one of these hotlines if you saw cheating going on. And there were international election observers, but they weren't really trusted to do a thorough job because they couldn't be everywhere. And so my job was to drive around with this van that had a 2-way radio connected to the hideout. So people would call in on the hotline, and then someone at the hideout would dispatch the van with me and a driver and I think a bodyguard. There were 3 of us in the van, and would dispatch us to wherever the cheating was. I would use my credentials to say I'm with the press, and then I would document the cheating so that later we could build a case against the cheaters, right? It was just a scale of cheating that's incomprehensible to a Westerner, especially an American. And I got to witness a lot of this cheating firsthand. The most disturbing thing I saw that day, which really sent chills, and that's when I started to realize, oh shit, like we're really in for it, was we got a call in the van. We went to a schoolyard where a bunch of young election observers, these were kids who were all my age, basically college kids. They gathered in the schoolyard because they had been another gang in another poor area of town, gang of armed thugs had showed up and had basically, they shot there was an older man with them who actually tried to guard the ballot boxes, and they shot him in the head. And so they fled. The rest of these election observers fled. And I don't know if the old man who was shot was an election observer or just a citizen who didn't want to give up his ballots. And the gang had showed up to take control of the ballot boxes. And so I remember vividly interviewing one kid who was basically my age, like interviewing someone just like myself, and he was just in a complete state of shock, just talking really fast, like, I can't believe what they did, they killed so-and-so, they shot him. And I was like, what happened? I'm trying to get facts and document things, and I just, like, that really shook me up, because that was the first time I realized, wow, like, people are going to die. It hadn't occurred to me that violence would get that extreme. And of course, this was just the beginning. So essentially, what we were left with at the end of that day, the opposition, was a situation where the ballot boxes already in Manila were being tampered with. We couldn't imagine how bad the situation was in the provinces, because there's far less security. There's no election observers, and especially not international election observers out in the provinces. How are we going to protect the integrity of these ballot boxes? The enormity of the scale and degree and various methods for cheating has started to dawn on me, and suddenly I realized, like, he is going to cheat on a vast scale and engineer this election for himself, and that's not fair. And so the opposition is scrambling, trying to figure out how we're going to stop this. Someone in the international press got a call saying, be at this church, such and such a church, across the street from the National Computer Center. And so all of these journalists descend on this church. And shortly after that, 14 workers, including 2 or 3 supervisors, from the National Computer Center run across the street into this church seeking sanctuary to tell the international press that they had been ordered to cheat in order to rig the results in favor of Marcos. So that was like absolutely damning evidence of what was going on. It was incumbent on Reagan to basically decide whether or not this cheating should be called out. Because if the Americans withdrew support of Marcos, then the whole thing could collapse like a house of cards. And so all of the Filipinos that I knew in the opposition movement, my relatives, my cousins, aunts and uncles, were waiting, because the only thing that can help them at this point, the only person with enough power to stop this, is the US president. We're all watching the television in anguish, and I remember the scene. This is one of those scenes that really stands out in my head. We were at a bar, we were watching bar or restaurant, we're watching the television because the news is going to come on, and we're just waiting for Ronald Reagan's announcement. Like, what is Reagan going to say about this? And he gets on the television and he says that there was cheating on both sides. And I remember watching the television, and that was one of the worst sinking stomach feelings I've ever had in my life. And I remember looking around and sensing the mood in the room, and people were just shocked to see the US president basically declare that he's not going to take sides. That was really, really sobering, because I suddenly realized, wow, now we're in for it, because how are we gonna change this result? We don't have any power. And I couldn't see a way out of this. Okay, so you're up against this president who has supreme power of the state. He has the police, the armed forces behind him. He's shown his willingness to go to just complete extremes in violation of all international norms to engineer the selection in his favor. He's clearly not going down without a fight. How are we gonna fight this, right? And so one of the first things we did was we had a huge demonstration. Like 1 million people showed up, and I've never been in a sea of people that. I mean, it was a good thing I was tall, because I was like look around. But I mean, just a massive demonstration. I remember that. And I think Marcos at that point realized that he couldn't just crush the demonstration, so we didn't face any kind of violent repression at that point. So we had this huge demonstration, and then there were strikes, shut down the bus, shut down the public transportation system, shut down anything you can shut down, commercial businesses. You bring the city to a standstill, and still nothing's happening. Several weeks went by, and we're into February at this point, and this is when the shit really hit the fan. Tito Pepe, my uncle, he's a classmate of Marcos. He also happens to be a high school classmate of Juan Ponce Enrile, who happens to be the Minister of Defense. So Johnny and my uncle were classmates that go way back. And my uncle came to me one day, Tito Pepe came to me one day and said, you want to go out to the beach house, William, with me? And I said, sure. And to this day, I'm convinced that he was doing something illicit, and he needed to go to the beach house in order to have security, because the house that we lived in, his house, was bugged. So he and I get into the car, go to the beach house, and spend like 2 or 3 days. It wasn't very long, 2 to 3 days there. And I think he had various conversations with various people. And then suddenly one morning he came to me and he said, get your things together, William, we're leaving in 10 minutes. And I realized something big was going down. So we get in the car, we drive back to Manila in like 3.5 hours. And the next scene I remember is I entered the house, and my aunt, this, grande dame, white-haired, jewelry and everything, she's cluttering down the steps, this big spiral staircase. She's cluttering down these steps in her high heels and everything, and she's gesticulating, she's like, big scoop, big scoop. I remember her going, big scoop. And I was like, what? She said, the Minister of Defense and the head of the armed forces are defecting. And they're going to make an announcement in Camp Crame, which is this largely ceremonial army camp at the top of there's a big belt line, like it's a multi-lane highway that forms the big inner oval. It's like a horseshoe-shaped highway that essentially rings the innermost part of Manila. And it's called Epifanos de los Santos Avenue, EDSA. And so she said, yeah, they're going to make this announcement at Camp Crame. So I run upstairs to my cousin Benji's room, head of security, and he is pulling out a large hope chest from the front of his bed. And he opens the hope chest, and inside it are all these weapons, including automatic rifles, shotguns, etc. And he asked me if I want I think he offered me a .22 caliber revolver. And I had this brief moment of clarity where I realized any situation where I would be tempted to use this, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be better if I don't have this. So I'm going to turn it down. And so I made the right decision in that split second. No, I don't want a weapon. And then I went over to, so he told me, okay, well, go get a ride with Robert. So Robert is his sister's husband. So I go across the hall. Robert's got his handgun, and we're going to get in a car. I was going to get in his car, and we were going to drive up to Tito Doy's house because that's where everybody was gathering. And so we get in the car. Robert hands me his revolver, and he says, "Here, put this under your seat." So I put it under my seat. We drive out, and we weren't like 5-10 minutes from the house when we went smack dab into a roadblock set up by the Army. And fortunately, we saw it with enough lead time that he was able to pull into a side street, and they didn't see us. Otherwise, we would have been like arrested, and they would have found a revolver under my seat. Oh, what's this? So anyway, we took back roads, and we drove up to the camps. On the left, you have Juan Ponce Enrile, Johnny, my uncle's classmate from college. And on the right, you have Fidel Ramos, West Point educated head of the armed forces. What these two men did is they summoned a bunch of journalists. They got about 50 soldiers. They got on top of a van with a megaphone. And Fidel Ramos made the announcement, and I was there, I was watching this. He made the announcement that the two of them had decided that the election results were not constitutionally valid. So that tantamount to declaring yourself in rebellion. We hold that these results are not constitutionally valid, and we are calling for the people of the Philippines to protect us and the soldiers who we are calling to our cause. They called on the entire armed forces to follow their orders and not uphold the presidency. And so what resulted was essentially a 3-day civil war. But they called on the people of the Philippines to surround these 2 small military camps where they made this announcement. Surround these 2 camps. They had seized one of the television towers, and they also called on people to surround the presidential palace. And he called on nonviolence to solve this problem. I'm sure he had seen the level of protest, but he couldn't be sure how many people would actually show up, especially when everybody in the Philippines knew what Marcos was capable of. And so overnight, 3 million people showed up and set up barricades. I was given a walkie-talkie, and I was supposed to communicate back to my uncle, my Tito Doy's house. I was supposed to report from a sector that I was assigned to in the perimeter of these camps. And this sector was one where we straddled a section of EDSA, this inner belt line basically. And so 8 lane highway, we had taken a bus. There was at least a bus and a tractor trailer. We let the air out of the tires and we used them as barricades to block any vehicles from coming up. That was the second time that night that I saw a bunch of guys who, when I was young and impressionable, I thought they were supposed to be really, really tough. And I saw that they were absolutely scared out of their wits, these young soldiers, because they realized that Marcos was going to retaliate. And they were probably looking around realizing that they didn't have anything to defend themselves with against tanks, aircraft, artillery. But of course, what everyone was worried about, what was going to happen as soon as Marcos gave the order. And the predictable response would be, the Army sending out a bunch of tanks and armored personnel carriers and basically cleaning out the rebels. By the next day, there were people showing up from the provinces. That's how rapid the public response was and how, what a massive outpouring. But that night, I remember people showing up with water, which was really useful. They showed up with food that they had made. And I remember someone also set up a large, we had no no defense against tear gas. We had no gas masks. So someone set up a large vat of water with lime juice in it. And what we were supposed to do is take a handkerchief and dip it in the lime juice and hold it over our face. And that was supposed to mitigate the effects of tear gas. And, everybody that night was just, everybody's both like thrilled, excited, and scared out of their wits. Here I am, I'm 22 years old at this point, and I'm just realized this is like my baptism of fire. So the next morning, sure enough, a massive military convoy issued from one of the main military bases at the base of EDSA, and they pull up the horseshoe heading towards Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo. And the only thing that saved us that day, I'm convinced, was the depth of the Roman Catholic faith. The Filipinos were the most devout Catholics I've ever met. And most of them had gone to some sort of church school run by nuns or priests. And so what happened was that there was as a convoy made its way up EDSA, they ran smack dab into a wall of people. And at the front of that wall of people were nuns and priests holding rosaries, praying, and basically pointing at the soldiers who were driving the tanks and the APCs, telling them that if they ran over their fellow Filipinos, they were going straight to hell. And the captain of the unit pulled off into an abandoned lot. He was going to call in his superior and ask, what should I do? There are people blocking the road, right? Of course, as soon as the tanks and the armored personnel, the APCs stopped in the lot, they were surrounded by people, and they just, effectively, and that's where you had nuns and priests and civilians linking arms and singing church songs, basically hymns, and singing patriotic songs. These soldiers were just absolutely terrified that they were going to go to hell, and they didn't want to, they didn't want to run over their fellow people, and so that was basically the standoff that saved us the first day. And then the standoff ensued for the next couple of days. And I basically spent all night and most of the morning on my section of the barricade. And then we would drive home. And I would get some sleep in the afternoon and then go back out. So that was basically my shift for 3 days straight. So I came home one of the days and to the house, my Tito Pepe's house where I was living. I go up to the television and of course it's on and people are trying to see what's happening. So you're going to turn to the news channel. And I checked the government controlled news broadcasts, and they're saying this is a minor demonstration. I think they use words like there's a minor demonstration. It will soon be under control. Everyone's to remain calm and stay in your houses, and this will all be taken care of. And then a lot of talk about what Marcos was doing, and then a lot of presentation of the national and international news as if nothing was happening. And then I turn the channel, and you get the rebel-controlled television broadcast. And there are two newscasters. They're not wearing makeup. They're not wearing fancy clothes. They have stacks of papers in front of them, and they're just reading what they know of, what the reports are saying from the papers that they were being given. So it's like, we have reports of this base possibly defecting. We'll confirm more later. The defenders at Camps Crame and Aguinaldo could use water. If you're heading that way, bring some water. And they need food at this destination. So they're just telling where people should go, what they should bring, precautions. They're reporting possible firefights breaking out. And so here it's like in one brief moment of about 2-3 days, you had two different versions of the truth on your mass media. And so I just found that fascinating, because it was the first time it occurred to me that, wow, if you control the television stations and the media, and you can present a version of the truth, people might believe it. If you don't see the reality of what's happening, and instead are given an alternate reality that supports the people in power, you're going to be at an enormous disadvantage, and you're going to be very inclined to believe the version of truth that's not true. By the third night on the barricades, things were really building to a crescendo. There was a tremendous amount of international pressure on the Marcos regime. A lot of international leaders, I think including the U.S. by this point, were pressuring Marcos to step down. On the barricades, we knew that he had to do something, and he had to do something really dramatic. And we were expecting it this final morning, the morning after the third night. That night, I'm on the cab. I'm sitting on top of the cab of the tractor trailer, and I remember thinking, wow. I remember looking around and realizing, wow, there were a lot more people here 2 nights ago. Our numbers seem to have thinned. Where did everybody go? And what if this doesn't turn out well? What if Marcos actually essentially pulls the trigger and launches a full-scale attack on these camps? We've got no defenses. People have thinned out. We're not going to be able to stop this. So the next morning at the crack of dawn, I remember looking out over the horizon, realizing that the horizon's getting red. And I thought, wow, this is probably it. Something's going to happen, because something has to happen. It's the third morning now. And sure enough, I started to hear in the distance the thump, 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 this telltale sound of helicopter rotor blades. And I looked up the horizon, and I saw 8, 10, 12 helicopter gunships heading right towards my position. And the next memory I have is looking around as these helicopters, and of course I'm frantically calling on the walkie-talkie, they're coming. I'm trying to count the number of gunships, and I looked around. I remember looking around at the people, and there was this one indelible moment in my mind, in my memory, where I looked around and I realized that most of the people around me were about to run. And I just had this sinking feeling like I'm going to be left here all by myself. And so anyway, the helicopter gunships flew right over my head to land in the camp, the military camp that was held by the rebels. And I jumped off the cab, and the next memory I have is I ran towards the camp where the gunships were landing, because in my head I was like, I have to see what's happening, because I have to tell headquarters that, this is happening, and I have to give them details. So I ran back into the camp, and one of the helicopter gunships was landing right in front of me, and a bunch of soldiers came out, led by an officer who was doing this, and he had tied a ribbon around his gun. So he was defecting. And he hadn't told his soldiers they were defecting until they were in the air. Because, of course, he couldn't risk word getting back to any of the loyalist officers. And his men went along with it. And so instead of witnessing a bloodbath, I witnessed a bunch of soldiers coming out of these gunships and defecting. And to me, that was the big turning point. I was yelling at my walkie-talkie, they're defecting. And shortly after that, a bunch of trucks and riot police and American riot police gear showed up, and they were surrounded by thousands and thousands of civilians and rebel soldiers, and there was a big standoff. And I remember being right at the point where a priest went up to the captain of the riot police and basically told him this is all over. We had just heard that Marcos was going to leave, that the Americans were going to give Marcos a plane to fly him and Imelda, his wife, to Guam. He eventually surrendered, and all the riot police put down their gear, and everybody let out a big cheer, and then my walkie-talkie ran out of battery. So this is written November 2nd, 1964, to Tito Pepe. The stationery is the Republic of the Philippines Senate, so he was a senator at this point, Ferdinand Marcos. And it's written on the eve of the election, which would elect him as the 10th president of the Philippines. And he writes, "Dear compadre, I have decided to send Juanjo to see you personally." So Juanjo is Juan Ponce Enrile. "I have decided to send Juanjo to see you personally before your arrival because I am convinced I should not make any decisions here without consulting you. Since I owe my life to the late President Laurel, I have decided to follow your decisions, not only as a token of respect for you, but as a remembrance of the old man. And I will do so even if it should prejudice my candidacy. For as you know, there is nothing, not even my life, which I would not offer to the old man and his successors." When Marcos became a dictator, and the Laurels initially were on the fence, but later they opposed him, he could not act against them. He couldn't act against Cory Aquino because she was the widow of the man he was accused of killing. And he couldn't act against the Laurels because he had publicly declared that he owed their patriarch this eternal debt of gratitude and considered him like a father and considered his sons like his brothers. This bond was so strong that it affected Marcos's political strategy and his ability to hold on to power. Initially, it was a really heady, intoxicating feeling to know that we had all been part of something that had overthrown this really evil, unquestionably evil dictator and his wife, and restored democracy to the Philippines. And it was a really, really heady feeling, and I think everyone I knew, and myself included, felt that we had done something really good and something that was going to go down in our lives as one of the best things we'd ever done. Cory Aquino and my uncle Salvador Laurel were inaugurated as president and vice president. And of course, when you have an inauguration, you have to have inauguration balls and inauguration parties and feasts. And I remember vividly this one moment when there was some sort of society matron seated next to me. And so she, an older woman with silvery hair, and she had on all her finest jewelry. She was probably a relative of one of my aunts. And I remember she leaned back in her chair and dabbed her face with her napkin, put it down, and she gave out this contented sigh and said, "Oh, it feels good to be back in power again." Up to that point, I hadn't grasped that was the goal of the wealthy people who had supported Aquino and Laurel. I didn't quite grasp how wealthy the Aquinos and the Laurels were. This woman was from the upper class, and she was keenly aware that they were back in power again, and things were going to be run the way they had been before. And we're going to get these upstarts out of, a clean house, basically. And I remember as soon as I heard her say those words, I just felt this chill. You have that skin, the hair on the back of your neck crawling, feeling, and it's like feeling down my spine. I felt my face getting red, and I felt queasy in my stomach, and I just realized, wow, something's going on that's not good, and I need to figure this out. Within not very long, 3 or 4 weeks at the most, I decided I had to leave. I couldn't take it, and I flew back to the U.S. and went to work in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. The People Power Revolution that I was part of really wasn't a revolution per se at all. It's really a restoration of the status quo ante, the state of the Philippines prior to Marcos' dictatorship. And since then, I really don't think anything's changed, and that's the sad part. Cory Aquino wasn't really able to change anything as the president for her 6-year term. They changed the terms to 1 6-year term, so you couldn't have another dictator. And then Fidel Ramos, he became the second president of the Philippines from 92 to 98, and he wasn't able to make any large-scale reforms, and so the country remains very, very corrupt. There are a lot of really, really good people in the Philippines who really do believe in democracy and have been unable to move their country to a condition that warrants that name.